Welcome to Lesson 7, Managing Emotions in Difficult Conversations. Throughout this program, we've encountered a recurring theme. Our elephant, our automatic thinking, has enormous influence over our judgment and decision making. It often leads us down the wrong path and blinds us to other ways of seeing things. It turns out our elephant can also derail our discussions by causing us to lose control of our emotions, but not to worry. In this lesson, we'll teach you a valuable psychological skill to help you gain more control over your emotions. Developing this skill can increase your personal well-being, improve your relationships, and help you navigate difficult conversations. By the end of this lesson, you'll have the tools to recognize when your elephant is leading you into trouble, master your emotions in difficult conversations, and navigate challenging conversations more successfully. Let's begin by thinking through a scenario. Imagine your teacher says she'd like to meet with you, but she doesn't indicate why she requested the meeting. Immediately, your mind jumps to the worst conclusions. You think to yourself, I must have failed the test. Why else would she want to meet with me? For the rest of the day, you're consumed with negative thoughts. You start thinking, this will drag my grade down. My entire GPA will be ruined and my future career prospects with it. I don't really deserve to pass this course. They probably made a mistake by letting me take this course. In this situation, how might you be feeling? Anxious and worried, or excited and optimistic? Go ahead and record your thoughts on your doc now. Pause the video if you need to. That's understandable, considering all those negative thoughts you had. Finally, your meeting arrives. Your teacher invites you into her office and says, Hi, I wanted to let you know that you got a perfect score on the latest test. You got every question and every extra credit question correct. In all of my years teaching this class, no one has ever done that before. The fears you had throughout the day suddenly melt away. Now imagine we went back in time to the earlier part of the day when your teacher first told you she wanted to meet. What if, instead of assuming you had failed your latest test, you thought about how much work you had put in preparing and asked yourself, maybe I aced my test? In this situation, how might you be feeling? Anxious and worried, or excited and optimistic? Indicate what you would be feeling in this circumstance. Do that now. That makes sense. Isn't this interesting? The situation is exactly the same in both cases. Your teacher told you she wanted to meet with you, but didn't give you any context. Your thoughts were the only thing that changed. This leads us to two important insights. There's more than one way people can interpret a situation. The way we interpret a situation will shape how we feel. Now you might be thinking, what does this have to do with difficult conversations? When we have conversations about issues we're passionate about, our emotions and the emotions of our conversation partner are often running high. We can be so overwhelmed with anger, frustration, or indignation, it can feel like our blood is boiling. In this state, we may feel like we have no control over how we respond. We sometimes end up saying or doing things that damage our relationships. Now this doesn't mean our emotions are bad. In fact, emotions often provide important signals we should pay attention to. They're also responsible for all of the joy and positivity we experience. You can think of emotions as being like flashlight. They can provide valuable illumination in the dark, but when they shine directly in your eyes, the intensity can make it blinding, making it harder for us to see what's right in front of us. Can you think of a time you were so blinded by emotion that you couldn't think straight? Yes or no? Indicate your response. Many people can relate to feeling as if their brain has been hijacked by their emotions. There's a biological reason why this happens, especially when we find ourselves in disagreement with another person. When we're at odds with someone, our brains can activate the body's fight or flight response, which prepares us to flee or defend ourselves against predators. This sends a surge of adrenaline through our bodies and deprives our brain of the resources it needs for controlled thinking, our writer. In these moments, our brain is basically all elephant. It's practically impossible to use any careful reasoning. That's not good. No kidding. At this point, our elephant usually leads us down one of two paths. Shutting down, we go silent and refuse to open up further, or we lash out and attack others with explosions of intense emotion. Neither of these are good options. Shutting down means we won't make any progress towards reconciling our differences, and lashing out permanently damages our relationships. There's another way to handle moments when our emotions start to feel overpowering. We can gain control over our elephant instead of being controlled by it. The hidden intermediate step. There's a step between what happens and how we feel about it. It often happens so quickly that we don't even notice it. But this step makes a huge difference in how we feel and act towards other people, especially when we're having a really difficult conversation. In this hidden step, our brain creates an automatic interpretation of what we experienced. We have an event, we have interpretations of that event, which lead to our feelings. In response to events, our elephant creates automatic thoughts. You may experience this as part of the ongoing inner monologue in your head. Our automatic thoughts can contain all sorts of details we've invented in order to tell ourselves a cohesive story about our experiences. For example, we may automatically assign motives to someone's behavior. We also may make judgments about whether those motives were for good or bad. Essentially, we can judge people's character based on a narrative we've imagined. He must have said this because he's angry with me. These interpretations determine how we feel about what's going on. And this leads us to a life-changing insight at the core of this lesson. The way we interpret events rather than the events themselves determines how we feel. This insight has been the bedrock of many branches of ancient wisdom for both the East and West. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said, "What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind." A few hundred years later, the Greek philosopher and former enslaved person Epictetus agreed, saying, "What really frightens and dismays us is not external events themselves, but the way in which we think about them. It is not things that disturb us. It is our interpretation of their significance that might disturb us." Does this ancient wisdom apply today? The thoughts, feelings, and actions cycle. Absolutely. In fact, the idea that we react to our interpretations of events rather than to the events themselves has been validated extensively by contemporary psychology and neuroscience. The psychiatrist Dr. Aaron Beck transformed the ancient insight into one of the most effective evidence-backed forms of psychotherapy, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Dr. Beck demonstrated how our feelings are shaped by our thoughts in what he called the thoughts, feelings, actions cycle. Here's a brief example to see this in action. When we have an experience, we generate automatic thoughts about the event. For example, your teacher's request to meet with you could spark the thought, "I must have failed the latest test." These thoughts lead us to having feelings about the event. Thinking you must have done poorly on your last test could make you feel anxious and worried. Our feelings then inform our actions. While you're in an anxious state, you might pay less attention to your work and be less friendly to others. Then our actions create new experiences which prompt new automatic thoughts. This self-perpetuating cycle can get us stuck in a rut, repeating the same unproductive pattern of thoughts, feelings, and actions. So what can I do? Take control of our interpretations. Then we can disrupt the cycle. With intentional practice, we can train ourselves to take control of our interpretations until it becomes an automatic habit. This can make us happier, sharpen our thinking, and improve our relationships. We can even do this during difficult conversations, which can help us navigate them more successfully. To summarize, how do our automatic thoughts influence the way we feel and act during difficult conversations? Write down one of the following. Because our interpretations are automatic, there's nothing we can do to counteract how they make us feel. Or write down, our automatic thoughts can lead us to feel and act in a particular way, but we can intervene by changing our interpretations. Use complete sentences and ideas even though they don't, because this is an English class. Thank you. Pause the video if you need to. Exactly. We can't stop our elephants from generating automatic interpretations, but we can use controlled thinking, our writer, to adjust them. To begin, we're going to identify some common ways our interpretations can go awry. Mental traps. As we just explained, our elephants create our initial interpretations, and there can be flaws that we're totally unaware of. We'll call these errors in our thinking mental traps. The more formal term is cognitive distortions. Mental traps or cognitive distortions tend to be exaggerated and negative. These automatic thoughts can be about ourselves or others. There are a number of extremely common traps we all fall into that can make sensitive conversations even more difficult. We'll go through 3 of these mental traps together. Then we'll teach you a simple 3-part process to detect these traps, pull yourself out of them, and gain control over your emotions. Let's get started. Jumping to conclusions is the first mental trap. This is our tendency to assume something without enough evidence. Jumping to conclusions usually takes one of these forms: mind reading. This is where we assume we know what other people are thinking without sufficient evidence. Fortune telling. This is where we make predictions, often negative ones, about the future without adequate evidence. Remember, our brains are Teflon for the positive and Velcro for the negative. We have a negativity bias. This is because it helped our ancestors survive. Let's look at an example. How do you feel about government entities banning businesses from using disposable plastic bags? Write down whether you support it, because businesses should use recyclable bags and encourage their customers to bring their own reusable bags. Or write down, I oppose it, because businesses should have the freedom to use disposable plastic bags if they want to. Write down one of the following options, or a third if there's something else you're thinking. Pause the video if you need to. Imagine that your classmate heard you sharing your view and said, wow, you really believe that business owners' freedom is more valuable than the humans' lives that will be lost due to climate change? In this example, your classmate jumped to conclusions about you. How would it make you feel if they said this about your view? Would you feel A, unfairly judged and offended, or respected and treated fairly? Write down your response. That makes sense. You never said anything about not caring about threats to human lives, but your classmate made assumptions about your thoughts and motives without adequate evidence and painted your view in a negative light. Now imagine your classmate responded to your opinion differently. Instead of accusing you of not caring about threats to human lives, they took a moment to reflect before saying, that's an interesting view. I think this is a pretty complicated issue. Have you considered the possibility that plastic bags are contributing to dangerous levels of overpollution that may put people's lives at risk? Now, how would you feel in this scenario if they said that? Would you feel unfairly judged and offended, or respected and treated fairly? Write down your response. That makes sense. Most people say that when someone asks them their opinion, instead of making assumptions, they feel respected. If you catch yourself jumping to conclusions about someone else, think back to how it felt when your classmate did that to you. Later in this lesson, we'll show you how to correct yourself when you jump to conclusions. Let's move on to the next mental trap. All or nothing thinking. This is thinking in terms of extremes without being able to acknowledge nuance. This is also called black or white thinking, because when we think this way, we fail to recognize shades of gray. When people talk about how others are either good or evil, with me or against me, that's a clear evidence of a mental trap. All or nothing thinking is often easy to detect because it typically involves words that express absolutes, like everything, always, never, must, or definitely. For example, imagine that you're chatting with Matthew and you mention an idea about how to improve your campus policies. Before you can even finish sharing your idea, he interjects with a thought, everybody knows that idea would never work. Now, how would you feel in response to Matthew's comment? Would you feel respected, or offended, or something else? Write your response now. That's understandable. Matthew's claim that everybody knows your idea wouldn't work shows that he's engaged in all or nothing thinking. Since he couldn't possibly be aware of what everybody else thinks, it's pretty clear that he's exaggerating. His elephant may be leading him astray, and that means having a thoughtful dialogue might be challenging at the moment. How can I have a conversation with someone who's fallen into mental traps? Well, rest assured, you can still have a productive conversation with someone who succumbs to a mental trap. We all fall into them occasionally because we're all human and make mistakes. In our next and final lesson of the program, we'll learn some specific techniques to get a conversation back on track after someone's elephant causes trouble. All or nothing thinking is extremely common. It's much easier to think this way than to acknowledge nuance, complexity, or shades of gray. The only problem with seeing two opposing options instead of a full spectrum of possibility is that it doesn't reflect how the world actually works. The truth is often a balance between two extremes. Thinking in extremes can also derail conversations. Too often we dismiss other people as being against us when we disagree, instead of giving them a chance to explain themselves. Once we have this narrative, it's difficult to have a productive conversation. One last mental trap, labeling. This is where we assign a judgmental label to somebody or something based on one trait or limited evidence. For example, you might assign labels to yourself like I'm an idiot or I'm a failure, but you aren't just thinking of one thing. In the words of psychiatrist David Burns, your life is a complex and ever-changing flow of thoughts, emotions, and actions. You are more like a river than a statue. Would you think of yourself exclusively as an eater just because you ate a sandwich, or a breather just because you breathe? We often also label others. For example, you might think he's an idiot or she's a bad person. Just as the labels we assign to ourselves are often inaccurate, the labels we assign to others are too. Labeling others often shuts down conversations and damages relationships. When you call someone names, you're riling up their elephant. They'll probably feel attacked, hurt, or defensive. They're likely to walk away from the conversation or hurl insults back at you. Let's see an example of how labeling people affects our feelings towards them. Imagine that you're talking with your classmate Shen about a teacher who's being considered to become the next principal of your school. This teacher happens to be a Muslim. Shen says she's not sure this teacher is really qualified for the position. You feel your body tense up and you hear yourself blurt out, "The only reason you think he's not qualified is because you're Islamophobic." When you think Shen is Islamophobic, how interested are you in continuing a conversation with him? Not at all interested. Absolutely interested. Drag the scale from 0, not at all interested, to 100% absolutely interested, or some percentage in the middle. It's up to you. Write this down now. Thanks for responding. Shen likely won't appreciate being called Islamophobic, and this conversation could turn hostile. You could still rescue the situation, but things are probably going to be somewhat tense between the two of you. This example shows the trouble of our elephants can cause when they're driving what we say and how we act in difficult conversations. Imagine you thought, I wonder why Shen thinks this. I'm curious to understand what's driving his position, even if I disagree. How would you feel about continuing the conversation now? Slide the scale to answer 0%, not at all interested, 100% absolutely interested, or another percentage somewhere on the spectrum. Make your decision now. Based on your response, many people say that they're more open to talking to Shen if they gave him the benefit of the doubt. Author and educator Manji explains that when we assign labels to other people, we are reducing people to something less than they actually are. She encourages us to keep in mind that everyone is just as complex and multifaceted as we know ourselves to be. Also, other people may react differently to you if you label them. This is an example of how your automatic thoughts, feelings, and actions affect other people's actions, not just your own. Follow the chain of causation here to see how we're all affecting each other, whether it's online or whether it's in person. What you do, what you say, what you think, it matters, both in person and online. It does ripple outward for all eternity. Let's review. We've just looked at 3 types of mental traps or cognitive distortions, and we've explored how they can lead our emotions to hijack our brains and derail our interactions. To summarize, these mental traps are jumping to conclusions, reaching a conclusion without enough evidence, all or nothing thinking, thinking in extremes without acknowledging nuance, labeling, assigning a judgmental label to somebody or something based on only one of the traits or limited evidence. Now we can put this knowledge to use to avoid these traps and pull ourselves out of the ones we've fallen into. There are more traps than the ones we've covered, but 3 is enough for now, and it's more important to practice overcoming mental traps than it is to learn every single one. Some other traps are catastrophizing, where you blow things out of the proportion. Oh, I failed my test, it's the end of the world. Filtering, I only pay attention to certain negative things a person says about another group as opposed to the positive things they say. Overgeneralizing, this is extrapolating a pattern from a single event. One person does one thing, and we say that they always do it. Disqualifying the positive, this is where you ignore information about a person or their views or a group of people and their views, even if it's positive, focusing only on the negative. Personalizing, this is where you assume things are your fault. We've provided some additional resources later if you're interested in more. Earlier in the program, we learned a powerful framework for steering ourselves back towards clearer thinking when our elephant causes trouble, the taking the reins method. Let's build upon it by adding a few more techniques to overcome mental traps. By practicing this method, you can begin to form a habit to identify these mental traps and gain control of your emotions before your emotions control you. Before we get started, let's recap the basic steps of taking the reins. Step 1, detect when your elephant might be in control. Step 2, pause to give your rider time to catch up. Step 3, correct your elephant's missteps. Step 1, the first step to overcoming mental traps is developing an awareness of when they're happening. This can be surprisingly hard to do. It's much easier to spot errors in another person's thinking than it is to detect our own mistakes. But hard doesn't mean impossible. It just takes a lot of practice. In this lesson, we'll help you practice discovering this self-awareness and give you guidance on how to continue practicing this skill. There are a number of warning signs we can pay attention to in order to identify that our elephant might be in control. In this case, we'll focus on the warning signs associated with automatic feelings. The easiest way to detect the warning signs associated with our automatic feelings is to pay close attention to their physiological effects, that is, how our feelings manifest in our bodies. All of our strong negative automatic feelings, anger, hurt, fear, and so on, share a common foundation known as distress. You can tell you're in a state of distress if you have any of the following bodily signals. Your heart starts to beat faster, your body starts to tense up, your breathing becomes quicker and shallower, your face feels hot and flushed. When you notice any of these signs, it's good to consider if you're headed towards one of the automatic thinking traps. Step 2, pause to identify the trap you've fallen into. Once you're aware of the warning signs, you should pause to slow down. This allows your rider to regain control. Although this may sound trivial, pausing to take a breath is an incredibly powerful tool. It helps us regain control in heated moments and sharpen our thinking so we can make better decisions. Try taking a deep breath. As you do, notice the air moving through your nose into deep in your belly. Feel your belly rise and then fall. After you've paused to calm down your elephant, your rider can identify if you've fallen into any mental traps. Let's practice identifying mental traps in a few of the examples. Which traps do you detect in this thought? Anna just said that she doesn't think concealed carry should be allowed on school grounds. Clearly, she doesn't care at all about the Second Amendment. Select all that apply. Is she labeling? Is she using all or nothing thinking? And or is she jumping to conclusions? Check all that apply. Write down all that apply. Specifically write them down. Don't just say all or some. Write down specifically the ones that apply. You got it right. The statement, clearly she doesn't care at all about the Second Amendment, is an example of jumping to conclusions about why Anna doesn't think concealed carry should be allowed on school grounds. This statement also displays all or nothing thinking. It assumes that Anna is either 100% committed to the Second Amendment or she doesn't care about the Second Amendment whatsoever. In reality, there are a lot of shades of gray between those two extremes. Let's consider another example. Do you detect any traps in this thought? This person's social media profile shows that she follows Fox News anchors. It's definitely not worth my time to talk about sensitive topics with her, since she's clearly a brainwashed conservative. Check all that apply. Is this an example of all or nothing thinking? Jumping to conclusions? And or is this labeling? It could be more than one. It could be all three. Write down all that apply. Do that now. Pause the video if you need to. That's exactly it. Calling someone a brainwashed conservative based on one observation is an example of labeling. The thought also demonstrates jumping to a conclusion about what someone thinks without sufficient evidence. Lastly, saying it's definitely not worth your time to speak up with them shows you're thinking in extremes. Now that we've practiced identifying these mental traps, let's move on to one final step. Step 3, correct your elephant's missteps. Once we're able to identify the traps in our automatic thoughts, we can plot our escape using our rider, our controlled thinking. As we learned from ancient thinkers like the Buddha and Epictetus, we have the power to control our interpretation of the world around us. We can choose to take a step back, analyze the situation clearly, and carefully identify a productive way to interpret it. You can think of this as your rider outsmarting your elephant by reframing your thoughts. There are a lot of ways to challenge flawed automatic thoughts and replace them with reframed alternatives. We recommend applying 3 techniques we call the 3 E's. Check for evidence. Consider all the information that could inform your judgment. Is there proof your thoughts match up with the facts? Eliminate exaggeration. Take a closer look at the words featured in your thoughts. Are they blowing things out of proportion? Can you dial them down a notch? Consider alternative explanations. Take some time to think. Could the underlying reason for what you observed be different from your first assumption? Are there other ways to explain the situation? Let's practice using these techniques to escape our mental traps. We'll start reframing our thinking using examples we've already seen. Then we'll put it all together using a new example. There were 2 traps present in this automatic thought. Anna just said that she doesn't think concealed carry should be allowed on school grounds. Clearly, she doesn't care at all about the Second Amendment. We identified them as jumping to conclusions and all or nothing thinking. Now let's practice using the 3 E's. We can begin by checking the evidence for this thought. Do you know with certainty that Anna doesn't care about the Second Amendment? Next, let's examine exaggeration. A few words in this thought, like clearly and not at all, go to extremes. Can you swap them for more nuanced language? Lastly, we can consider alternative explanations. Can you come up with other reasons why someone who cares about the Second Amendment may think concealed carry still shouldn't be allowed on school grounds? Now that you've applied these 3 techniques, you can substitute a new and improved version of your thought, a reframed thought. What would be a reframed version of this automatic thought in bold? Write it down here using these 3 steps to generate it. Pause the video and do that now. Here's another way to reframe your thinking. It's possible that Anna doesn't care about the Second Amendment, but I suppose it could be that she thinks concealed carry in particular is dangerous, specifically at school. Notice how the new thought doesn't rule out the possibility that Anna doesn't value the Second Amendment. However, instead of assuming there's only one way to explain someone's position on this issue, it considers other possibilities as well. Remember this automatic thought? This person's social media profile shows that she follows Fox News anchors. It's definitely not worth my time to talk about sensitive topics with her, since she's clearly a brainwashed conservative. This thought involved all 3 traps. It jumped to conclusions, it was all or nothing thinking, and it was labeling. Now let's reconsider the evidence for this thought. Do you know for a fact that this person is, quote, a brainwashed conservative? Now let's eliminate exaggeration. Is it true that a conversation definitely won't be worthwhile, or is this just a mere possibility? Is it so clearly the case that she holds extreme views? Finally, consider alternative explanations. Can you think of reasons why someone would follow a Fox News anchor even if they aren't a conservative-leaning thinker? Now's your chance to reframe your thinking. What would be a reframed version of this bold-faced automatic thought about the person who follows Fox News anchors? Follow the 3 steps, reframe this thought, and write out the reframed version now. Pause the video if you need to. Here's another way to reframe your thinking. This person's social media profile says that they follow Fox News anchors. I suppose that might be that they might be interested in learning what conservative learning people have to say, specifically to understand the views of people who think differently than them. But I won't really know what their views really are until I learn more about them. Now we can take a step back and ask, how would this reframed thought make you feel towards this person? Probably better than the original automatic thought made you feel. When we interact with people who have values that differ from our own, it's what we make of those differences that determine how we feel about each other. By choosing to control our thoughts and emotions, we can set ourselves up for more constructive conversations about the issues that matter most to us. Are you saying I should be positive all the time? Not at all. Reframing is not about being unrealistically positive. It's about seeing things in as realistic and balanced a way as possible. And charitable, I might say. Charitable for the person. Assume they're doing their best. Sometimes the most realistic interpretation might even be more negative than your original interpretation, but in many cases it will be more positive. To recap, we can use taking the reins to manage our emotions by following these steps. Step 1, detect when your elephant might be leading you into a mental trap. Step 2, pause to identify mental traps you've fallen into. Step 3, correct your elephant's missteps by reframing your thinking. Now let's see how we can reframe our thinking in a disagreement with someone. We're intentionally using a very sensitive, emotionally charged issue so you can put these skills into practice in a controlled setting. To start off with, we'd like to hear your view on the issue of immigration, which is commonly referred to as migration outside the United States. Some people believe these countries need to create more legal avenues for immigration. How do you feel about creating more legal avenues for immigration? I completely oppose it, 0%. I fully support it, 100%. A balanced view, 50%, or some other percentage. Indicate a percentage as to whether you fully support it or completely oppose it. Do that now. Imagine that you're chatting with Theo, who mentions that he opposes creating more avenues for legal immigration. You disagree with his stance on this issue. As you listen to Theo speak, you notice that your face is starting to feel hot and your heart rate has sped up. When you notice physical sensations like these, what should you do? Should you pay closer attention to your automatic thoughts or ignore them and pretend like nothing's happened? Write one of the following. You direct your attention to your thoughts as Theo continues to explain that he opposes creating more avenues for legal immigration. Imagine you catch yourself thinking about Theo. I can't believe he opposes creating more legal avenues for immigration. He's obviously a radical nationalist. He must sympathize with the anti-immigrant agenda. Do you detect any traps in this automatic thought? Write down all of the traps that you detect in this automatic thought. Do that now. Pause the video. Great job. First off, calling Theo a radical nationalist is an example of labeling, defining a person's character on the basis of one brief encounter. You've also jumped to conclusions by assuming you know why Theo opposes creating more avenues for legal immigration without asking him to share his reasoning. Lastly, using the words obviously and must shows you're thinking in absolutes, which is a sign of all or nothing thinking. Now let's apply the 3 E's to reframe your thoughts about Theo. You once thought, I can't believe he opposes creating more legal avenues for immigration. He's obviously a radical nationalist. He must sympathize with the anti-immigrant agenda. Let's reconsider the evidence. Are you sure the evidence you have shows that Theo is a radical nationalist, or that he opposes creating more avenues for legal immigration for this reason you assumed? Right, yes or no? Right, it's hard to judge someone's character based off one encounter. And besides, just because someone disagrees with you doesn't mean they're a radical nationalist. Also, you don't really know the reasons why he opposes creating more avenues for legal immigration. It might be something else that you didn't assume. You won't know his reasoning until you talk to him. Next up in the 3 E's, eliminate exaggeration. In what ways might you be exaggerating by thinking he's obviously a radical nationalist? He must sympathize with the anti-immigrant agenda. Explain how this might be an example of exaggeration. Pause the video if you need to. Thanks for sharing. You might have pinpointed phrases like he's obviously and he must as instances of exaggeration in your thinking. You can eliminate those exaggerations by substituting those words with alternatives like it's possible that he, it could be that, and so on. These phrases leave room for the possibility that Theo might be different from how you initially interpreted him. Let's wrap up the 3 E's by considering alternative explanations. What's a possible explanation for why Theo opposes creating more legal avenues for legal immigration? Pause the video and write your response. Great work. Let's say you think to yourself, it's possible that Theo opposes creating more legal avenues for legal immigration for this reason, the one you cited. Let's check in with how you feel about this conversation now that you've considered a different interpretation of Theo's statements. How does your current feeling about Theo compare with how you initially felt when you labeled him a radical nationalist? Take a moment now, write a few sentences that describe how your current feeling compares with how you initially felt when you labeled him a radical nationalist. Thanks for sharing. After reframing their thoughts about Theo, most people are more comfortable proceeding with this conversation. They're also in a mental and emotional space that sets them up for more successful conversations about this sensitive topic. By approaching Theo in a less emotionally charged state, you're more likely to understand why he believes what he believes. You might also be more effective in shifting your beliefs than you would be if you resorted to shutting down or lashing out. Think of a time in the past few weeks you felt a significant negative emotion. For example, maybe you felt rage, aggravation, betrayal, or humiliation. What was the automatic thought that sparked the emotion? If you can't remember exactly what it was, just guess what you might have been thinking. Write the automatic thought that sparked the emotion of rage, aggravation, betrayal, or humiliation. Now, does this automatic thought have any mental traps? If so, what are they? Check all the mental traps present in your thought. Did you jump to conclusions? Did you use all or nothing thinking? Did you label? Write down all the traps that were present in your thought that sparked the emotion of rage, aggravation, betrayal, or humiliation. Next, take a step back and reread your original thought. Can you reframe that thought in a more balanced way? You might try reconsidering the evidence, eliminating exaggeration, or considering alternative explanations. So take this initial thought, the one that sparked, the automatic thought that sparked the emotion of rage, aggravation, betrayal, or humiliation, and now reframe it, okay, by examining the evidence, eliminating exaggeration, and considering alternative explanations. Write your reframed view now. Think about how that would have made you feel in that moment. Would you have felt better or worse than you originally felt? Write down better or worse. We're glad to hear it. We've learned quite a bit in this lesson. This feels hard to do in real life, and it's true. Despite knowing all this, it can be challenging to put this into practice. Even if we're aware of mental traps, they're likely to pop out in our thinking anyway. So, are we doomed to have errors in our automatic thoughts and suffer from extreme emotions no matter what? No. It may seem like a lot of work at first, but the more we practice, the easier it becomes. This process of identifying mental traps and reframing our thoughts gets faster and more intuitive. Eventually, it can become just as automatic as our automatic thoughts themselves. By taking control of our interpretations, we can gradually gain more control over our emotions, which can prove especially helpful in tough conversations. Keep a thoughts journal. In your journal, draw a table that looks like this: time, negative emotion, automatic thought, any errors, mental traps, the 3 E's, check for evidence, exaggeration, and evaluate alternatives, and reframed thoughts. Okay, draw a table. You can go to insert a table, okay, that looks like this if you want to use that on the doc. Alternatively, you can print these out. Over the next 24 hours, whenever you experience a negative or extreme emotion, write it down. Then in the next column, write down the automatic thought that sparked the emotion. Determine whether any errors are present in the thoughts, and if so, identify the traps that you may have fallen into. In the next column, specify how you fell into those traps. How did your elephant get things wrong? Finally, reframe it all into a more balanced thought. We'll guarantee you'll find this educational, if not enlightening. Keeping this kind of journal can be a transformative experience. If you like it, continue to do it for the following week, and then you can submit it at the end of the week for credit. This is not an option. We all have to do this. All right, before we wrap up, let's do some brief self-reflection. What are the key takeaways you learned in this lesson? Write those down. And then, in the upcoming week, explain how you will implement the takeaways in your life. 3 to 5 sentences for both. Good luck.